time for questioning as possible. My name is Joel Barkan. I'm a senior associate here with the Africa program at CSIS. And this particular event today is the first of a series that we're going to be running over the next year on issues of governance security in Eastern Africa. And before we turn to today's guest, I'd like to ask Jennifer Cook to tell you a little bit more about this, because there's also going to be another event this afternoon.
Yeah, as Joel said, this is the first of our East Africa Forum. It's looking at the region kind of as a whole.
About this, particularly with the support from the Ford Foundation, which enabled our first guest to come today. I think the introduction need not be long for Peter Anyang Nyong'o. It's a special pleasure to welcome him here to CSIS and introduce him as an old friend back in academic days and even student days. Dr. Nyong'o received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago in 1977. He then began one might call a conventional academic career. It wasn't conventional for very long at the University of Nairobi. He was outspoken about the injustices of the Moi regime. It got him jailed at several occasions. He left the country. He was in Mexico for a number of years, in Ethiopia, but eventually returned when the Kenya made the tortuous transition to multi-party politics in the early 90s. He was elected to the Kenya National Assembly for the first time in 1992 and has been a member of Parliament ever since. When the NARC coalition came to power in 2002, Dr. Nyong'o became the Minister for National Planning and did yeoman service in that position until the cabinet broke up after the constitutional referendum in November of 2005. Since then, as many of you know, he has been a pillar member of the Orange Democratic Movement. One might argue it's intellectual brains. He's the Secretary General of the party. He has been intimately involved in the negotiations and in the events that you're all familiar with that have unfolded over the last 2 months. So it's particularly timely that he's here, and I'm going to turn over the floor to you without further ado, and then we'll have an extensive period for questioning.
Thank you very much, Joel.
One thing, could you turn off your cell phone? You heard mine go off, but better early than in the middle.
Thank you very much, Joel and Jennifer, for inviting me over to the CSIS. I'm very happy to be here and to meet old friends, old students like my friend over there, John Muller. John was my first graduate student actually at University of Nairobi. And then he left. Has been here ever since. I see Mark Bellamy here, our ambassador to Nairobi, so many people. So I'm happy to at least get this occasion to meet old friends and colleagues. But secondly, I intended really to do a good job today. So I compiled a very good document which I thought I would pass around. But yesterday at Penn Station in New York, as I was talking on my mobile to my daughter, some liberator liberated my bag and with all my things. But apart from the papers, they were not really very useful things. But Peter Gakuno here and Beldina were good enough to take me to, what do you call that thing? Kmart or something like that. Almost close to midnight. So if you see me dressed reasonably well, it was thanks to the textile industry in this country. But I called Nairobi last night and got my colleague who is with us in the Pentagon, one of our research people. He was just coming out of the Prime Minister's dinner party. But he promised he would email a copy which we can download after this, and I hope can be passed around. Joel asked me to come and give a talk on the Kenyan situation, which is a really mammoth program. Let's begin in the following manner. Lots of you, I'm sure, have kept abreast on what has been going on in Kenya. But I just want to maybe make a summary of recent events and then go back a little to try and see why things happened the way they did. Because many people were shocked that Kenya, which had been a beacon of peace, stability, and all those good things you people talk about, all of a sudden went back to Hobbesian times. And it was quite shocking. And immediately, there was quick action in all fronts to make sure that, as it were, normalcy is restored. And this we can begin by looking at the Annan agenda, the negotiations at Serena Hotel, which brought back some amount of stability. And I underline that, some amount of stability, because that's very important, because it is itself problematic. The Annan agenda had 4 key elements. And these key elements, perhaps, summarize in a very succinct manner the Kenyan problematic. 1, the need to halt violence, restore peace, and freedoms. And that was done by all parties agreeing that we go out, preach to people, restore peace, and you can now, after that was done, drive from Kileleshwa to Lang'ata without fearing that somebody will top you on the way. Or you could take a bus from Nairobi to Busia and not get your head chopped off. It was very important that that kind of normalcy be restored. So life goes on, as it were, as normal. But as you can see over the last few days, that has now been put to question. The second thing was to address the humanitarian crisis and promote reconciliation, which was done with people who were in police stations, particularly in the central province, being evacuated, going and joining families and so on. But the internally displaced persons are still there. And Professor Saitoti and myself chair a committee which started working even before the swearing in of the one ministers on emergency response to the crisis, which came out with a brown paper, not a blue paper or a white paper, on what needs to be done by government in conjunction with development partners to deal with this humanitarian crisis. The third thing was to form a ground coalition government, which would take care of the country for at least 2 years and make sure that it addresses these issues properly and puts the country on the road to democratic governance. But in order to do that, there was the fourth issue, the issue of fundamental institution reforms, which was seen as both a medium-term and a long-term agenda. Fundamental institution reforms, first in terms of constitutional reform, which has been in the works for the last 20 years, as far as I remember, one of the reasons why some of us went into politics. And within constitutional reforms, other issues like judicial independence, parliamentary oversight, authority, electoral reforms, and land reform. If you remember well, one of the major planks in the Bomas draft constitution was a new policy and approach to the land problem in Kenya. But since the Bomas draft never saw the light of day, the problem of land has continued to haunt us. And indeed, the whole issue of the crisis of IDPs revolves around the land problem in Kenya. And I will come back to that later. Now, one of the reasons why I'm sneezing is because Joel Barkan and his lovely family gave us dinner up to midnight last night. And the red one that he gave me was, I think, I think was blessed by the Pope. Now, what we have done in responding to these 4 agenda items from Kofi Annan's intervention is that immediately a commission has been set up to look at the electoral debacle, the issue why the electoral commission mismanaged the electoral process so badly. and what needs to be done to put in place an electoral commission that will stand the test of time and that will manage democratic elections in Kenya. The second thing that has been done is to put a committee to investigate into electoral violence. You can halt the violence, you can restore peace and so on, but unless you look at the fundamental causes of that electoral violence and put in place certain institutional mechanisms for avoiding electoral violence in the future, as you can see, it can happen again. The Grand Coalition government, on the other hand, is meant to be a holding operation to husband these reforms in a period of 1 to 2 years, after which it is hoped that Kenya can have an election where Kenyans will have the opportunity to put in place a government elected by the people and not leaders choosing their electors. You must understand there's a very interesting phenomenon in Africa now, maybe it is elsewhere too, where leaders choose electors rather than electors electing leaders. How does this happen? If you write the rules of the game in such a way that you predetermine who will be elected in the end, you actually chosen yourself. Or if you let people vote and in the end you close the votes in a cupboard and say they will not be counted because I am assumed to be elected, you actually elect yourself. You choose the voters and you say those ones who voted, those ones voted wrongly. The others who didn't vote approve of my being here anyway, so I'm now your leader following a democratic election. It's very reminiscent of Banda's statement. Banda was once asked by Philip Short that, Mr. President, people accuse you of being a dictator. Do you agree or not? And Banda said, yes, I agree. But I am a dictator that the people choose to put up with. So, and this is where you have African presidents. They are presidents which people choose to put up with, notwithstanding the fact that they are the ones who determine who to vote for them, and the people don't determine who they vote for. So we hope that within these 1 or 2 years, we'll put in place an electoral process which will rise up to the true democratic dictum, government by the people, for the people, and of the people. Now, what are the possibilities that this is likely to happen? That it's likely to happen that, according to an agenda, a grand coalition made up of the ODM and PNU will actually put in place a constitutional dispensation that will do away with the presidential authoritarian system and put in place a parliamentary democracy. Big question, but I don't want to answer it now. Let me answer it a little bit later. But a moment, let me try to look into why is it that it was not possible for the PNU to impose itself on the people of Kenya through a robbed or stolen election. There are several issues we must look into. One, there are multiple interests in the Kenyan political scene. I will begin with an interest closer home, the American interest. One must understand that the U.S. has the largest embassy in Kenya, in Africa, today. It used to be in Liberia many years ago, the years of the Two-Whig Party. But then the Two-Whiggers were sent packing. I think Kenya now is one of the largest embassies in Africa. Is that right? I think so.
It is.
It is. So that's a major investment, and you're not going to play around with it, because it doesn't just serve Kenya, it serves the whole region. And if you look into the future, and you want to deal with the African command thing in Stuttgart and bring it to Africa, you're likely to bring it somewhere within the vicinity of that embassy, logistically speaking. I think it's fair to assume so, although in these days of good communication it could be anywhere. But that investment is very important. Secondly, there is the issue of counter-terrorism, countering terrorism. Given the instability in the Great Lakes region, and given the economic importance of Great Lakes region, you must understand the Great Lakes region is where the Democratic Republic of the Congo is, with all its contested wealth since the 1960s. And the Great Lakes region where Sudan is, and these are two of Africa's largest countries and largest economies potentially. So the kind of political system that exists in Kenya and, as it were, guarantees American interest is very important to the U.S., I think. The third issue why Kenya is so important is because the role it has played in providing humanitarian access to the region. A region that's politically unstable, where terrorism can occur any time, you need to send food. I understand the Americans are feeding the Zimbabweans the rate of how many $1 million a month? That can be done through South Africa, but maybe even food aid to Sudan, to Somalia, and all these humanitarian things must have an entree point, and Kenya provides it. Not to forget that not just for the Americans, but the region as a whole, it is also a hub for communication, air communication and so on. And fourthly, there's the issue of being a diplomatic partner in the politics of the Great Lakes. Whether you're talking about Somalia, you're talking about Ethiopia, the proximity to Addis Ababa, an issue that the Americans share with other people. And finally, I think, which is very important, is the role of UN headquarters in Kenya and what are called the spillover effect in the region to what happens in Kenya. These, I think, are some of the strategic reasons, I think, where not just the U.S. government, but other governments would be concerned about what happens in Kenya, more than what happens in Somalia, Djibouti, and some of these states around. I mean, nobody comes from this. But I mean, we consider.
Our former ambassador to Djibouti is here.
Okay. But secondly, and not just the U.S., you go back to Africa. African countries take Kenya very serious. First, the fight against Afro-pessimism is not something small. I remember going around during this crisis to Tanzania, to Uganda, to Ethiopia, and even talking to Somali, and all they were saying, if Kenya fails, what next? Or as the Somalis were saying, Kenya is like an uncle. If he dies, whom do we turn to? So this fight against Afro-pessimism, which people want some successful stories in Africa, and this is why Zimbabwe annoys very many people. And Zimbabwe has no reason to be what it is today, except for Mugabe. But also the role of Kenya in terms of regional integration. COMESA, IGAD, East African communities, regional investments. The Rwandans, the Ugandans, the Tanzanians, the Somalis, the Sudanese, especially the Southern Sudanese, invest heavily in Kenya, not just in real estate, but other things. They invest in the stock market, as you saw with the IPO of Safaricom, which has problems, but nonetheless, they do invest there. And of course, the provision of services in the region. Secondary schools, primary schools, a lot of people within the region actually make use of services from Kenya, not to mention hospitals and financial and insurance services. When, therefore, the crisis occurred, there were all these interests that were concerned about its solution. Now, even China sees Kenya as a gateway for her commercial interests in Africa. So does Japan. Great Britain, of course, there are these ties that bind us with Great Britain, which are many. Great Britain's investments in Kenya are substantial. The East African Society really operates between London and Nairobi. John Small and the other gentleman, the shuttle between Nairobi and London as heads of the East African Society. But why did Kenya break down? If all this, I'm not talking about the Kenyans themselves not wanting the breakdown. Why did it break down? I think it broke down because of the following. First, the immediate cause, the stolen elections. It annoyed Kenyans. Kenyans were poised for change after the referendum. The ODM had done what I consider quite a substantial work in mobilizing Kenyans to expect this change. The stakes were very high. The stakes between the PNU and the ODM, and both sides of the divide expected a free democratic election to settle the contest. And people voted in their big numbers. And I remember even a friend calling me from Kiambu and said, well, now that the ODM is leading by 1 million votes, we can accept to live with an ODM government. But when all of a sudden things were done at night, at the Electoral Commission, in KICC, in broad view of television lights and so on, and you could hear comments from Radio Tanzania, Tanzania Television, and all the others about what was happening, it caused tremendous crisis of identity with the people, with the electoral process. And the reaction was spontaneous against what happened. And you must remember that in the final analysis, all struggles for democracy are first and foremost struggles about the rules of the game. How do the rules put down in such a way that they lead to a contest that is free and fair? When people saw that the rules of the game were themselves being violated by the very institution that was expected to protect them, the Electoral Commission, it was really upsetting. And don't think that is something just only intellectuals understand. Even the man on the street could speak about it. He said, but we voted yesterday. We think the Electoral Commission is the last body that should do this. So if they can't look after our votes, let me take a panga and chop the next fellow, because I think he is responsible. And thirdly, one of the major causes of why Kenya collapsed was because of what I called the failed or the frustrated process of reform that started in 1991 and came up to the year 2007 without being fulfilled. The reform of the Constitution. You remember in 1991 when Section 2A, just one section of the Constitution, was removed, that removed the possibility of continuing a one-party system and introduced the possibility of a two-party system. It was seen by the people of Kenya as a major breakthrough. Because for the first time, another party other than KANU could hold a rally in Nairobi. And the first rally in Kamkunji was attended by about 500,000 people. So that was seen as a major breakthrough. After that, people expected more to come. But then they have been very slow to come. In 1997, where there was the reform of the Electoral Commission, where Moi agreed that other parties could nominate people to the Electoral Commission with regard to their proportionality or membership in Parliament. It was agreed, but it was not written into law. But Moi observed it all the time he was president. Kibaki was a beneficiary of this dispensation, and on that dispensation he was elected in 2002, but decided that since the thing was not written into law, he was not going to observe it. So he staffed the Electoral Commission with his men and women. Out of 22 commissioners, 19 were Kibaki appointees. Contrary to the agreement in 1997, Kenyans saw the clock being turned backwards at a time when it should be going forward. Again, in 2002, in order to deal with the authoritarian constitution, the opposition came together in a broad coalition called the National Rainbow Coalition, in an agreement written in a memorandum of understanding, which was not written into law. As soon as Kibaki was a beneficiary of that understanding, he decided to go against it. So the process of reform was always being frustrated, A, by the authoritarian presidency, and 2, by not changing the authoritarian constitution at all. So when in 2007, another broad coalition was formed by the Orange Democratic Movement, which was able to win the majority in Parliament and the majority of the vote for the presidency, but that then defeated to the manipulation of the Electoral Commission. This caused a major crisis in society. So we ask ourselves, under what circumstances can this authoritarian regime be transformed through the popular vote? One, there are possibility if the authoritarian regime itself becomes too weak to continue in office. If it becomes too weak to continue and so forth, purely internal reasons, it can be defeated in an election, notwithstanding the constitution. By being too weak, I mean, if it cannot control the Electoral Commission, it cannot manipulate the army to support it, the police and the administration police, the National Security Intelligence Agency, and so on. If all these institutions are too divided or too weak to support the authoritarian regime, you can actually defeat it in an election. And this is what happened in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, one of the reasons why the MDC was defeating Mugabe is because there's tremendous division in the armed apparatus of the state. The Central Intelligence Organization was on one side, the army was on the other side. So Mugabe could not actually easily manipulate the electoral process. All he could do is make sure, wait until it voted, and then begin locking the votes in the cupboard and refusing that even if they are not counted, it doesn't matter. But in Kenya, on the other hand, Kibaki was still very strong. Controlled the National Security Intelligence Services, the army command is on his side, administration police had just been given support by the US, and they recruited more people, he had recruited more policemen, so the armed apparatus of the state were on his side. So I think it was comfortable to say, well, you can vote, but I will call my boys to deal with you characters, which he did. And I tell you, the kind of beating we got during demonstrations were not small. Secondly, if there is, in the event that it is not terribly strong, but it has access to militia, like Mugiki and so on, it can resort to the use of militia to maintain itself in power. This is not just with reference to Kenya, and other African countries too, where militias have been used to protect an unpopular regime even when it messes up with elections. But thirdly, if there is such a strong hegemony of reform politics that in spite of the strength of the authoritarian regime, the hegemony of reform movement itself can force it out of power. And this, by the way, was the crisis in Kenya after the vote was stolen. The reform agenda, the reform forces were so strong in the media, you know, the FM stations, the television, there were so many, they were bombarding the government with all kinds of critics. Civil society is strong with a reform agenda, and the reform agenda had also now been supported by development partners. You remember, in 1992, 1997, development partners were there, but they never really came out very strongly to support the reform process. They did it in a lukewarm manner. But this time, because they also knew there was a very strong civil society, a very strong press, development partners could actually march to Kenyatta International Conference and take a stand. I think they took a stand because they knew that we have real partners who can power with us in this process. But the other thing is that this authoritarian regime can also be defeated in an election in spite of the authoritarian constitution if it cannot easily resort to mobilize purely ethnic support for itself. Now, the PNU was trying to mobilize purely ethnic support, and to some extent that was the rhetoric on which it was trying to survive. But even within that ethnic bloc, there were still voices of dissent which were pretty strong. People like Maina Kiai and so on, very, very strong. And they had a constituency which was supporting what we were saying, and which also came up in the private sector alliance and so on. And finally, if it can use fear-mongering politics effectively, and this is what did not succeed in Kenya. Fear-mongering politics was there, but it could not be that effective given the hegemony of reform politics in society. Now, what therefore does the Kenyan experience show? The Kenyan's experience, I think, show the following things. That if the constitution remains authoritarian and the incumbent regime defy the outcome of an electoral process and can resort the use of armed might, it can actually stay in power. But the other thing that the Kenyan experience shows that attempts to do that with faced with a very strong reform constituency in the country is not very easy to get away with. And I think this is why the Annan initiative succeeded, because at the discussions you could see the PNU sticking, or the ODM must go to court, we are not going to move. But out there, the papers, editorials were telling them this is unviable. The church was telling them this cannot be tenable. The development partners say this cannot be tenable. Trade unions were saying this cannot be tenable. So although on the one hand it tried to keep itself in power by using fear-mongering and whatnot, but the reform constituency could not let it go. And therefore it was possible for the Annan process to succeed. Don't think that the Annan process succeeded because Annan is a genius, of course, but I think without that kind of atmosphere, I don't think it would have succeeded. Now, but finally, I think it is important to say that structural and constitutional reforms are necessary conditions for frameworking elections as processes for democratic change in Africa, particularly in Kenya. Structural and institutional constitutional reforms are necessary conditions for frameworking elections as processes for democratic change in Africa. That's very important. You can have elections like you have in Ethiopia, but without reforms, they cannot lead to any kind of democratic change. I mean, so African countries can comfortably organize elections every 5 years, religiously. But if there are no fundamental constitution and structural reforms, they lead to no democratic change. But in Kenya, we have reached a stage where the accord itself has embedded in that agreement an agenda for reform, particularly constitutional reform. And the best thing that CSIS can do for us is to monitor that process and keep a bird's eye and say, you people signed this. Annan, you signed. Kikwete, you signed. Mkapa, you signed. Kibaki, you signed. Raila, you signed. You said you are going to do it for 2 years. Have you done so? Item 1, 2, 3, 4. Because you are justified to make that demand. After all, as I showed you, your own society has a vested interest in Kenya. Although I would ask you to reduce your visa fees. So finally, what therefore must now happen in Kenya at this point in time? 1, priority must be given to the reform agenda. Agenda item number 4 on the Annan process. 2, I think preparations for giving the people an opportunity for electing their leaders must be put in place right now, because that is an outstanding grudge of the people of Kenya against their leaders. 3, there must be an intense conversation on a democratic political culture in Kenya. When people talk about tribalism, ethnic biases, and so on, we think that the thing that should happen is not to blame Kenyans all the time for being tribally divided, but to provide the opportunity for a discourse on a democratic political culture. And we in the ODM have proposed that the first conference we want to be held in Nairobi is a conference on the ethnic question. Let people come and talk about ethnicity openly without pretending that it doesn't exist. There must be a national conference on the ethnic question. What do Kikuyus hold against the Luos against Kikuyus, the Baluyas against the Majikendas, and they took our land, Kenyatta brought them here, Kenyatta should take them back. I mean, those issues must be put on the table, and the ethnic question must be discussed. Is it a question because of inequitable access to resources or not? Is that why it arises? So those are some of the issues that I think must be put on the table if indeed the Kenyan crisis is going to be addressed in a long-term fashion. Joel, I've talked too much. Thank you.